For every US president who is widely loved, there is also one who is universally hated. We go with the hated list first, starting with one of, if not the worst president in history, James Buchanan. Buchanan was the president of a very tough time in history. The Civil War seemed inevitable at that point. Still, as a president, Buchanan definitely should have done a better job to at least slow it down. He intervened in the Dred Scott case to support a decision that essentially recognized slavery as legal across the country. He thought it would settle the unrest between the two sides. That was never the case. The South was now confident that they could expand slavery to the whole country, while the North was outraged by the decision. When his successor, an anti-slavery president, was elected, many Southern states started to secede. During this lame duck period, Buchanan was still the president. He had time and power to prepare for the North for the war, but no, he was just sitting there and did absolutely nothing. He hoped a solution would come, but just refused to find it himself. Buchanan's excuse was that the situation was beyond his power. He left the office months later and left all the mess to his successor, Abraham Lincoln. People forever hate Buchanan because of his inaction during a critical time to save the Union. Fortunately, we got Abraham Lincoln, who did everything to do the thing Buchanan refused to do. After Lincoln's inauguration in March 1861, 7 Southern states officially seceded and formed the Confederate States of America. Just 1 month later, the Civil War broke out. After being defeated in the First Battle of Bull Run, President Lincoln realized that the war would be much more complicated and brutal than he initially thought. He called for another 500,000 troops to prepare for the war. Compared to the military-experienced leader of the South, Lincoln was just a newbie. However, that was not a problem with a quick learner like him. Many people from both sides were surprised at how quickly he learned about strategy and tactics in war, as well as commander choosing. Lincoln was very patient, yet also decisive, unlike his predecessor. Disappointed by General George McClellan's overly cautiousness, the president removed him from command after the Battle of Antietam, even though McClellan was well respected by his troops. Also after the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed all slaves in the rebellious states. This paved the way for the future 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery across the whole country. The war was now turned in favor of the Union. In 1863, Lincoln delivered his famous speech, the Gettysburg Address, which is still one of the most quoted speeches in history. Lincoln won the election in 1864 when the victory was close. He was ready to open a new chapter for the country with his plan of Reconstruction. Tragically, he was never able to carry it out. Abraham Lincoln is always remembered as one of, if not the greatest president ever for saving the country from dividing into two and ending slavery. That said, as great as he is, there is still some criticism against him. One of them is that he's, ironically, a racist. I mean, every president is a bit racist to be fair, but the next guy's is just on another level. Something needs to be clear first. Wilson's presidency was not all that bad. He has been usually considered one of the better presidents. It is just that, through time, people start to see him in a less and less favorable view. Okay, so one of the main reasons people hate Wilson is his racism. I know we should not apply our today's standard to people who lived a century ago. However, even for his time, Woodrow Wilson is extremely racist. He allowed the film The Birth of a Nation to be screened in the White House. The Birth of a Nation, as you already know, is notorious for portraying the KK as a heroic force necessary for saving American values. Some say Wilson didn't know much about the film before watching it. That might be true, but there is no excuse for his attempt to segregate the federal government, one of the few workplaces where African Americans witnessed some level of equity. He fired most African American civil servants and made the hiring process much harder for them. Around him, the race riots happened everywhere, but Wilson just cared enough to do nothing. Basically, Wilson set the country's civil rights backward. Another reason people see Wilson in a more negative light is how he dragged the US into the First World War. I mean, one of the reasons he won the 1916 election was his promise to not enter the war. He turned 180 degrees after being re-elected. Even worse, He later used the war to justify the Sedition Act and the Espionage Act, two of the worst acts in the US history. Talking about World War, another president also decided to enter another world war, but unlike Wilson, everyone supported him for that. Franklin Roosevelt's presidency is not all that rosy, though. His decision to run for more than 2 terms is controversial. His refusal to accept Jewish immigrants is bad, and his Japanese internment camp is horrible. However, his leadership before and during the Second World War overshadowed those bad things. So, back in 1937, the World War didn't even start yet, but FDR already saw the threats of Nazi Germany and the Japanese Empire. He warned his people about it. When the war broke out, he called for revising the Neutrality Act and helping Britain and France on a cash and carry basis. However, the war turned worse, and FDR passed the Lend-Lease Act to supply the US's allies. The Japanese then attacked Pearl Harbor. FDR declared war on Japan. His speech on that day was still one of the most famous speeches in the US history.
A date which will live in infamy.
He was the first president who go outside of the country when it was at war to seek relationships, even with the very different Soviet Union. He appeared on the radio daily to report the events of the war and call for American support. He also approved the Manhattan Project to develop nuclear weapons, which were later used at the end of the war. The Allies started to win the war, and Roosevelt met with his Allies leader to discuss how the world would work after the Axis' defeat. He, sadly, passed away before the day of victory. FDR's leadership during the Second World War is simply unmatchable. He not only held the country together in critical times like the Great Depression and the World War, but also did more than perfectly to help the Allies win against the Axis. No doubt he is so respected not only in his country, but also in many other countries. Another president also led the US out of a major war in the 20th century, but his reputation as a president is the opposite of FDR's. Richard Nixon is uncharismatic. He is paranoid. He is a liar. He is a crook. None of these traits suggests a popular president, right? Richard Nixon was involved in one of the most notorious political scandals in history, the Watergate scandal. The break-in was already bad, but Nixon made it even worse with his attempt to cover it up. How Nixon abused his power shocked the American people, eroded their trust in government officials, and eventually hurt the democracy of the country. Nixon did have some achievements, but he ruined his reputation himself. Today, when talking about him, the first thing being mentioned is always him being the first president to resign because of this scandal. The scandal is not the only reason people hate him. Even some of his achievements are still debatable. His reopening of the relationship with China paved the way for the Chinese to be the main threat to the US power as we see today. He helped get the country out of the embarrassment named Vietnam War, but he also prolonged the war just to win his presidential election. Not to mention the war on drugs, which for some people is an even bigger mistake than Watergate. Some people suggest that his failure in the 1960 presidential election crushed Nixon as a character. Ironically, his rival at that time, JFK, is the exact opposite version of Nixon, or at least Nixon as a president. Kennedy is good-looking, Kennedy is charismatic, Kennedy is also a fire speaker. I mean, some of his speeches are just too powerful, like this.
We choose to go to the moon.
Or this.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Don't get me wrong, Kennedy is not a perfect man. No one is. He has his own stinkers like the Bay of Pigs invasion. Fortunately, he learned from his mistake and knew how to not repeat it. You know what event I referred to, right? So, the context is that after the Bay of Pigs, Cuban leader Fidel Castro turned to the Soviet Union for help. The Soviets also wanted to respond to the US putting nuclear missiles in Turkey, so they deployed theirs to Cuba. When the US found out about it, some officials suggested Kennedy conduct another invasion of Cuba. JFK, however, did not agree and reacted far more cautiously.
A strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated.
He also tried to negotiate with the Soviet leader to de-escalate the situation instead of taking military action. The Cuban Missiles Crisis was settled peacefully when when the Soviets agreed to withdraw their missiles from the island. A potential doomsday was settled. People forever admire Kennedy for that. With all respect to what he has done as a president, another huge reason why JFK is so popular is his assassination and all the conspiracies around it. Moreover, people are always full of what-if questions when discussing Kennedy's legacy. During his short presidency, Kennedy got involved in many affairs. It tainted his reputation a bit. However, at least JFK didn't get sexual misconduct allegations like the next president on the most hated list. And yes, it is not only things people hate about Donald Trump. He is a loudmouth, he is a racist, he is a conspiracy theory promoter, and now he is a convicted criminal. Basically, everything you don't want as a country leader. Not only his personality and public image, but his presidency was also full of controversy. He pulled the US out of the Iran nuclear deal, which is a highly controversial decision. He also took the risk of going into a full-scale war against Iran after killing their top general. Fortunately, it didn't happen. His handling of the COVID pandemic was a disaster. After spending months downplaying its severity and spreading contradicting public messages, he had to admit he messed up and tried to fix it. And his action in the January 6th Capitol attack was the final straw for the American people. His undermining the election result and trying to overturn it by violence is an assault on the democratic process, undermining faith in the integrity of elections and the peaceful transfer of power. Still to this day, millions of people believe that the 2020 election was a fraud without any solid evidence. The country, which was already divided, now becomes even more polarized. The reason Donald Trump is so hated is that he undermined many American values that the most admired president ever, George Washington, helped build. Talking about the most loved president without including George Washington is a crime. Washington was one of the founding fathers who played a key role in founding the country. He is the symbol of integrity and selfless leadership. His refusal to be a monarch showed his commitment to the values of democracy. Washington even refused to become the first president at first. That showed his humility as a person. As the first president of the United States, he set many precedents for the office, including the peaceful transfer of power, the formation of a cabinet, and the two-term limit, which became a standard until it was codified in the 22nd Amendment. In short, Washington is the greatest president ever, and you can see the admiral he received from the American people everywhere. The capital of the country is named after him. People have a federal holiday to celebrate his birthday. He appeared in books, arts, and the money people use every day. Those are enough to say about his legacy.